Today we're going to talk about the Brothers Karamazov, and specifically one section of it, one chapter called the Grand Inquisitor. It's probably one of the most often excerpted portion of the text, and this is because there's a classic confrontation that takes place there. And you can think of this chapter as being something that's very easily read, and on a surface level very easily understood, once you know some of the cultural reference. And there's not too many difficult ones, but one that remains a mystery. It still holds some open questions for us that I'll point more towards the end of this lecture. So, what's going on in this passage? I actually am going to talk about a little bit more than just this particular chapter. I'd like to look at some of the other chapters that take part in that, this portion where Alyosha and Ivan are interacting with each other, this pro and contra, book 5 of the Brothers Karamazov. But first I want to say what's going on fundamentally in this chapter itself, the Grand Inquisitor passage. Let's think about narrative and also think about character. It's pretty simple when it comes to character, so we'll come back to that in a moment. And that'll make more sense when we talk about narrative. What's going on? We have several people talking, and then one of them tells a story, which actually he calls a poem. And it means poem in a somewhat different sense than we're used to thinking of, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So there's a story, and within this story there is a confrontation that takes place between I'm just going to use GI for Grand Inquisitor, and Jesus Christ to come back to earth as promised would happen sometime. And this is taking place sometime during the time of the Inquisition. So, who's telling this story? Well, this story about these guys is being told by Ivan Karamazov, one of the brothers. And Ivan himself is speaking with his brother, Alyosha. So there is at the same time a larger level of story going on here that we can point to. And who would be at the very top of this? It would be Fyodor Dostoevsky, telling us the story of a larger story within which these two brothers have a conversation, in the course of which one of the brothers tells a story. And it gets even more convoluted yet, because the Grand Inquisitor himself is going to tell a story as well. He's going to chart out a kind of history of human beings and God and interactions, suffering, happiness, freedom, all these sorts of things. So you can think of what's going on here as a process of condensation, or you think of it like telescoping in. You've got this larger project going on, and then it gets much more condensed until we finally get to a very coherent point of view being told by the Grand Inquisitor, who is really the central character of this chapter, although you notice that within the chapter itself, Alyosha and Ivan talk back and forth, and they even make some remarks about what's going on in the story itself. So that gives you a little bit of the structure of the narrative. It also tells you a little bit about the characters, but we should actually spell those out a little bit, depict them. Jesus Christ is showing up, and he doesn't say a thing, except at one point where he actually does say the famous words from the Gospel that come from Aramaic, Talitha Kumi, arise maiden. Other than that, he doesn't say anything throughout the entire piece. He does have a few very important gestures, but like gestures typically do, there's some ambiguity involved in the gesture itself. What is the meaning of what's taking place? What is the significance of it? It's not exactly easy to tell. We can come up with different interpretations. On the other hand, somebody who talks an awful lot is the Grand Inquisitor. And the Grand Inquisitor is a 90-year-old man. We know that he's a cardinal. We know that he's an inquisitor, meaning that he was actually one of the people who was charged with the task of protecting the faith, inquiring into the condition of heretics, that is, people who had, in one way or another, set themselves at odds with the Christian faith by taking part of the Christian faith and turning it against the whole. That's one sort of typical way of understanding heresy. Now, if you know anything about the historical inquisitions, there were more than one inquisition, you know that a lot of abuses took place during that time. Many people used it as a cover for power or for greed or sometimes even for self-protection. Oftentimes, religion and politics became intimately intertwined within this. Interestingly enough, when it came to the Spanish Inquisition, before the whole ball got rolling, the religious orders who were involved with it didn't want to be charged with it. They thought it was a bad idea. Who actually was the driving impetus behind it? It wasn't actually the Pope, it wasn't actually the Spanish Church, it was actually the king who was using the Inquisition for his own political motives. But once it got going, like a lot of these things, once they develop a sort of momentum, they allow all these sort of ways in which people who are less high-minded, even those who are fairly high-minded but are sort of ideologically blind, to insert their agendas into the mechanism. And that's sort of what's going on, except that the way that Ivan is depicting the Grand Inquisitor, he's not doing it for greed. He's not doing it solely for power. He's not doing it for all the, perks or pleasures or things like that would come with that sort of job. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. You notice that the day before, when they were burning all the heretics, he's wearing this full cardinal's garb, so you could say, very nice clothes. The next day, he's wearing a monk's outfit when the action actually takes place. So, what is he motivated by? That's part of what the story's about. That's part of what's going on here. He's going to tell you about his motivation. And in certain ways, you can understand what he's driving at, because he's a person who's genuinely concerned for humanity. He wants to make people happy. And not just happy in the sense of, tell them some jokes or, buy them some nice things. He wants to figure out what makes human beings tick, what would satisfy their deepest desires, and then go about actually trying to satisfy them. So in a certain way, you can think of him as a philanthropist, as a humanist, as a reformer. That's the Grand Inquisitor. He's also blind in certain ways. There's also something more going on there, and we'll get to that in a moment. So that's at this level. What about these guys? Well, the book is the Brothers Karamazov. And it's about these brothers and all the other characters who are tied in with their world and their father. They don't all get along. I'm not going to try to go into the very labyrinthine, complex storylines there that Dostoevsky lays out, just in part because there's no way we could possibly do justice to it. Suffice it to say, at this point in the story, Alyosha is in fact a postulant. He wants to become a monk. He is about to leave the monastery. He's looking at getting married, since he is leaving the monastery. And he's not naive. He is a very loving, in certain ways even timid soul. But we often have this picture of religious people as if they're just sort of withdrawing themselves from the world entirely and very, how do you say it? They're not streetwise. They have no sense about, you know, what makes human beings tick. They make stupid mistakes. Alyosha, he makes some mistakes, as do all of Dostoevsky's characters, but he actually has some pretty keen insights into human nature. And you know, you can't actually go into religious life without learning about aspects of yourself that you might have actually concealed up until that point. You have to dig into yourself. This goes whether you're talking about, say, Christian monasticism or Buddhist monasticism, Hindu monasticism, Islamic Sufism. All of these promote a sort of self-scrutiny, sort of exploration of who one is, what makes one tick, as well as what makes other people tick and how you relate to them. And you can see that in Alyosha. Alyosha is a religious believer, although not too far from this section. He actually asks his fiancée, you know, something along the lines of, would it surprise you to learn that I don't believe in God? He doesn't actually say he doesn't, but he's sort of testing waters. Ivan, on the other hand, is this very dynamic, somewhat tortured soul. He's the older brother to Alyosha, and he has traveled abroad. He is fairly worldly. He lives a secular kind of life. He claims that he doesn't buy into all of this religious stuff, and as a matter of fact, you can interpret the whole story that he tells as sort of like one big, you know, knockout blow against religion. That's a surface level reading of it. But actually, the story is a bit more complicated than that, and so maybe it's better if I just leave it at that. So that's our narrative, that's our characters. Let's now look at two other things. One is, Ivan calls this a poem, this whole chapter. He and Alyosha are having an argument about God and about whether God exists and about what that would mean. And he says, well, they get to the point where Alyosha makes reference to Christ in order to try to talk about the meaning of suffering. They've just had this long, involved conversation, which is worth reading for its own sake, in which Ivan lays out some of the terrible things that happen, all sufferings that children undergo, that adults actually take pleasure in inflicting on them. And he says, look, this does not make sense to me. I'm not saying that an absolutely good God couldn't countenance this, but the way that religious people are talking about this, that somehow it all balances out at the end in some sort of general harmonization or forgiveness, that doesn't jive with me. And yet, you know, there's something also about my desire to see the guilty punished that doesn't sit right either. So Alyosha brings in Christ, and at that point, Ivan says, you mean the one without sin and his blood? No, Alyosha, I hadn't forgotten about him. Indeed, I was wondering how long it would take you to bring him into our discussion, because the people on your side usually make use of him above all in their arguments. You know, well, don't laugh now, about a year or so ago, I composed a sort of poem, and if you're willing to waste, say, another 10 minutes with me, I could recite it to you. And then Alyosha says, you wrote a poem? And Ivan says, no, I didn't write a poem, per se. I've never written 2 verses in my whole life, but I did think it up, and I've memorized it. I've composed it in a moment of real inspiration. Well, you'll be my first reader. I mean, audience. So, he says the poem is called The Grand Inquisitor, and that's the chapter that we're about to look at. Why does he call it a poem? Well, you know, we have a different attitude towards poetry nowadays than people did throughout most of history and at the time of Dostoevsky. A few of us may have memorized poems in school, and if you did, that can be quite good. It gives you an object that you can wrap your head around. Any poem that's actually worth being called a poem articulates a view on reality. It may be as small as just, you know, this bottle cap, but it tells you about that bottle cap. It reveals to you sides of it that you hadn't seen before. They may not even be beautiful sides. You know, Baudelaire, a great French poet, one of my favorites, made a career out of writing about ugliness. Many people's poetry in the 20th century and the 21st century seems to dwell on the morbid and the ugly. What determines whether it's really a worthwhile poem is whether it sticks with you. Whether it's something that you, once you've seen, you have to keep coming back to. That's what this is for Ivan, and I think in a certain way it is for Alyosha. And if Dostoevsky's magic works on us, his skill, his craft as a narrator, this becomes something that we end up having stuck in our heads as well. Just like we would a song that really captivates us, that we have to keep thinking about it, not just singing, but thinking about. Think about, for example, Cats in the Cradle by Harry Chapin. Now that I've said it, it's probably stuck in your head, at least some of it. And if you think about it, it doesn't articulate a clear message. Well, you should live your life this way, this way, this way. It does tell you you probably should spend time with your family while you can, but it does so in a poetic way. And that's why it has its power, that's why it sticks with you. There's a certain sense of mystery in every poem, and that's there in the story of the Grand Inquisitor. So I just wanted to say a few words about what it means for it to be a poem. The other thing I want to do before we actually start analyzing this very interesting chapter is mention a few important remarks and passages in the chapters just before this, remarks that are made either by Alyosha or by Ivan that I think lend a certain context and color and character to the Grand Inquisitor passage. So one of these is Alyosha, and he's saying, he's talking about love. And he says, well, Ivan has just said, he's talking about love, I love those sticky little leaves in the spring and the blue sky, that's what. You don't love those things with reason, with logic, you love them with your innards, with your belly, and that's how you love your own first youthful strength. It's sort of a romantic notion of love, or appreciation, or attraction, or however we want to call it. It's not connected with reason, it's not connected with logic. It's something you feel, not something you think about. Alyosha says, I understand it only too well. It's the innards and the belly that long to love. You put it wonderfully, and I'm terribly glad that you have such an appetite for life, Alyosha cried. I've always thought that before anything else, people should learn to love life in this world. And then his brother says, to love life more than the meaning of life? Now, that's two very different things, aren't they? There's life in the sense of what one experiences, what is going on, and then there's the meaning of life. There's the significance of things being put together. And these are clearly not the same thing. It's kind of interesting, too, that Alyosha says, learn to love. Learning is very often an intellectual practice, rote kind of matter, isn't it? So learning to love, one has to wonder about that. So then Alyosha says, yes, that's right. That's the way it should be. Love should come before logic, just as you said. Only then will man be able to understand the meaning of life. And this is very profound. This is something that you see in a lot of different religious thinkers. It's a religious theme par excellence, at least within the Christian tradition, also within some of the other great religious traditions. The notion that knowledge is in some way dependent on love. That knowledge in a full sense requires loving the object being loved, or at least loving something involved with it. And not just loving the self, not just loving what you get from the object, but loving that thing. To really know a person, even to fully desire to know a person, you have to at least in some sense love them. You have to love something about them. So Alyosha is really hitting on something key here. Only after one loves will one be able to understand the meaning of life. That's an important prefiguring of this chapter. You'll see why in just a few minutes. So that's one passage. Another passage is where, and this is a very comic passage, I think actually, especially as a philosopher myself. It's where Ivan is talking about what are we up to here? What are we going to do? And he says, I'm going to be leaving pretty soon. It may not be in the morning, it may be later on. We're having lunch together here. You and I still have plenty of time to spend together before I leave, a whole eternity. And then his brother says, what kind of eternity is it if you're leaving tomorrow? He says, why should that concern us? As long as we have time to settle all the matters we've met to discuss. Well, why do you look so surprised? Tell me yourself then, why we met here. Was it to talk about, and then he mentions a bunch of sort of news of the day. Did we meet for that? Is that the purpose of our meeting? And then Alyosha says, no, I don't think so. So you know yourself what the purpose was. It's different with other people, we callow youths. We have, first of all, to settle the eternal verities that worry us. These are young men, and they are concerned with the question of the point of things, the big issue, what is the meaning of life? And, this question of what is the meaning of life, if you want to truly get to know somebody, you have to ask that question, not just in the general, but with respect to that person. So Ivan, part of his relationship with his brother is to get to know what makes his brother tick. What is the meaning of life for his brother? And Alyosha, in return, in order to know his brother and to love his brother, has to try to wrap his head around, which means first he has to find out what makes Ivan tick. What does he think about things? And, it's not just about trivial things. Do you like mayonnaise or mustard, things like that? What kind of music do you enjoy? Although that could have some important significance. Do you wear a red tie or a blue tie? It's about the big things. What do you think is the greatest good? Are we capable of that? Are we bound to be locked in conflict with each other, or is it possible for there to be harmony? Is there a God? Does God care about us? Are we just fated to do what we do, or do we have something like free will? How far does free will go? These are the sorts of things that really determine how you view life. These are what he calls the eternal verities. And he says all the young Russia is talking about nothing but those eternal questions, just at the moment when the old generation has suddenly turned its attention to practical problems. So this Grand Inquisitor passage, this is part of two brothers trying to argue with each other about what the point of the world is, what the point of the self is, what the point of other people and relations and all these other sorts of big issue things that are all bound up together, what those mean. That's what's going on. So that's an important passage as well. Another important passage, and we're kind of jumping a little bit here, is where they're going to talk about God. And Ivan says something really interesting, and he's admitting his own limits here. He says, for my part, I've long since stopped worrying about who invented who, God, man, or man, God. I won't bother to repeat to you all those fashionable axioms accepted by our Russian boys, blah, 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 blah. He's sort of, spinning his wheels a little bit. And then he gets to it and he says, for what is the purpose of this conversation between us? Its purpose, as I understand it, is for me to explain to you as briefly as possible what I am. That is, what sort of man I am, what I believe in, and what I hope for. So I will just state here plainly and briefly that I accept God. But I must point out one thing. If God does exist, and if he really created the world, then as we well know, he created it according to the principles of Euclidean geometry and made the human brain capable of grasping only 3 dimensions of space. So what he's saying there, I just want to stop for a moment. He's saying, if there's a God, he created this world, he created it according to certain structures, certain rules, and he created the human brain able to interpret and fully understand those structures. Yet, there have been, and still are, mathematicians and philosophers, among them some of the most outstanding, who doubt that the whole universe, or to put it more generally, all existence was created to fit Euclidean geometry. This is an interesting passage. What's going on here is symbolic of something larger. What does he mean by Euclidean geometry? Well, in Euclidean geometry, there are certain things that govern time and space. And there are things that would make sense to us. They're easy to work with. There are other geometries possible. Human beings thought of them. Now, that would mean, if there is a God, God could certainly think of those too, couldn't he? He would have created the human brain able to do that. God should be able to sort of take that in. And yet, Ivan is saying, no, if God created the world, he created it in a Euclidean way. And we're able to imagine things that go beyond even what God has created, the structures that he's had. And then he says, of course, myself, I can't really understand those. I'm a Euclidean kind of guy. Now, think about that no longer in terms of geometry. Think about that in terms of the human heart. In terms of the most complex thing in creation, the rational animal, the human being. If God created the human being in such a way that, and remember, we're part of the universe. It's not just that God creates creation and then we're, extra, and then our brains are part of it. We're part of the whole thing. If God created us in such a way that what we are would be fully explicable, fully intelligible to ourselves, then we actually could get to the bottom of the mystery. We actually could figure out at bottom what we are, how we tick. We could have complete agreement on it. And that's in part what the Grand Inquisitor is after, isn't it? And that's what Ivan yearns for and why he's so unhappy, because he doesn't have that. One of the things that religious thinkers have shown us in so many different ways is that if anybody knows what we are, it's not us, not fully at least, not all the way down. There's always bits of ourselves that sort of escape ourselves. And this is what we call freedom. One of the key themes of not only this Grand Inquisitor thing, but of the whole book. What is freedom? Because we're free, we have the capacity to create things we never even dreamed of, to escape the boundaries that seem to be placed upon us. And yet, we don't fully understand that freedom. We can even make bad use of it. We can screw things up. We can destroy freedom. That's one of the capacities of freedom. So that's a really interesting passage, I think. There are a few other passages that I think are kind of relevant as well. Once they get into the next chapter, rebellion, Ivan actually says, I think that if the devil doesn't exist and is therefore man's creation, man is made in his own image. And then Alyosha says, just as he's created God in that case, if you think that supernatural entities or the supernatural order are just fabrications of us, reflections of us, that would mean that we are actually the highest creature in all of, well, we couldn't even say creature, could we, right? We are the highest being in all of the universe in that case. It's very interesting that he says, I mean, this is pretty common to talk about man creating God in his own image. Even religious thinkers quite often caution against having an idea of God that's just basically us, projecting ourselves onto God. This is a classic Jewish and Christian critique paganism, by the way. It goes all the way back into the books of the prophets. But this is also something that secular thinkers will often say, that human beings have created God in their own image. Do we create the devil in our own image? Do we think of evil or a principle of evil or something like that in our own image? That's something really interesting to think about, given that the Grand Inquisitor talks about the devil in relation to God or Christ, and he actually seems to be kind of taking the side of the devil. He calls him that wise spirit. And he criticizes Christ for resisting the temptations of the devil. He says, you made a wrong decision, and we're going to fix things because of your wrong decision. So those are all interesting passages to sort of prefigure this. Now let's get into the actual meat of the piece. So I had said that there's a narrative being laid out by the Grand Inquisitor, and it's a narrative essentially having to do with goods and evils and temptations. Let's think about this a little bit. Let's sort of sketch out what he's saying. Here's it in sort of a nutshell. He's saying, human beings, you notice I haven't put up any evils here. Human beings are beset by all sorts of suffering. They oppress each other, they can't get along, they find ways to hurt each other, they don't feed each other, they don't treat each other right. Even when we try to alleviate suffering, often that creates new forms of suffering. We can displace suffering from one person to another. If God loves us, if God cares about us, you would think that God would come along and try to alleviate some of that suffering, try to satisfy some of our basic needs. And what are needs for? Needs are for goods. Needs are for good things that we are lacking. And the Grand Inquisitor says, and here he's sort of, he's covering a lot of ground, and he's not trying to, provide it in the beginning all the way to the very end. He's just trying to say something to this figure of Christ. He says, you screwed up. You didn't do what you ought to have done when you ought to have done it. That's why we're rejecting you while appropriating you at the same time. That's the narrative within the narrative. And all the other parts of that, which we're going to look at in greater detail, fit into that general scope. It's, you screwed up, you didn't solve suffering the way that you ought to have, so we're going to come in and we're going to make things better. We're going to, as he says, improve upon the divine plan. Because the divine plan looks like screwed up stuff that doesn't make sense. It doesn't satisfy. It works for those strong, those people, the saints, who are able to handle this. But for the mass of humanity, it's leaving them behind. It's, to appropriate a phrase, a race to the bottom for them. Now that's folded into a larger narrative. What's the larger narrative? Christ actually shows up. And he shows up at a church. Good place for him to show up, I suppose. And he shows up right after there's been an auto de fe and 100 heretics have been burned the day before. And when he shows up, he pops up at the church just as they're carrying in the coffin a young girl who has died. And they're all mourning. And so he goes over and he reenacts something that took place in the New Testament, in the Gospels. And he tells her to arise, and he brings the dead back to life. He gives back what was lacking, not only to that girl, but to all of the people surrounding him who are grieving. And he performs a miracle. And he does so, we're guessing, out of love. This is, a replication, but also a unique event taking place. The Grand Inquisitor sees him, and the Grand Inquisitor says, get him. Get that guy. And so his guards go and they take him. And the people are used to obedience, and they're kind of crushed down, in part because of suffering. And they allow this to happen. So Christ is the miracle worker, the guy who did this good thing, is taken away. He's thrown into a cell, and at night the Grand Inquisitor comes to visit him. And he says to him, "We're going to kill you tomorrow. As a matter of fact, those people who you were helping yesterday, they're going to help us kill you. They're going to be right there, and they're going to be cheering." Why is that? I'll tell you why. And this is when he goes into his whole narrative. I want to telescope a little bit to the end. I want to skip ahead before we come back into the heart of that story. Christ doesn't say anything. And the Grand Inquisitor tries to provoke him a few times, wants to get him angry at him, because he realizes that what he's doing is opposed to Christ. He's sort of co-opting him. And the only thing that ends up happening in the very end is Christ kisses him. And we don't know what the significance of that truly is. I'd like to leave that an open question. I don't want to try to solve everything in this. Christ kisses him. Is that a mark of love? Is it him telling him something like, "I forgive you"? Is he saying it's all right? Is it a provocative move? I don't know myself. What I do know is that the Inquisitor tells him, "Get the hell out of here." He opens the door and shoos him out to the night, so he's not going to execute him. And Ivan says, that kiss stayed with him, but it wasn't enough. Sooner or later, the old habits of thought came back, and it didn't change the Inquisitor's life, and he stuck with what he had. And what he has is a very coherent ideology. So let's look at that ideology now. And here's, I think, where we come to the real heart of the chapter. I think that this is fundamentally about goods and evils and temptations. What this is fundamentally about is goods, evils, temptations. This is the heart of the narrative itself, the heart of this chapter. So let's actually look at those. Love and freedom. These are two things that end up getting left out, or rather misconceived, by the Grand Inquisitor. And I think, to a certain extent, maybe even misconceived by Ivan. And I think that one of the lessons this piece is trying to teach us, not by coming straight out and telling us that, but indirectly, by making us think about it, is it's trying to challenge us to think about our own understandings of love and freedom as two goods that really ought to be seen as the highest goods, the ones that you don't trade other things for, the ones that make everything else work. Because what goes on in this, the Grand Inquisitor narrates this whole process by which human beings, for these things, for these goods, give up love. They give their love to something that they ought not, and they throw away or give over their freedom. These correspond to temptations, and this is what I think is Dostoevsky's most genius move here. He has the Grand Inquisitor bring up this passage of Scripture, which you find already in Matthew, where Christ goes out to the desert, and then after fasting for 40 days, the devil comes to tempt him. And the devil has three different temptations. One of the temptations is to deal with hunger. It says Christ was hungry. And the devil says, "Look at these rocks out here. Hey, you're Son of God. Turn them into bread. Then you won't be hungry." And the Grand Inquisitor is talking about this not just in terms of bread for Christ alone, but he could do this for whoever he wants. And if you think about the Gospels, there are stories where people are hungry and Jesus feeds them, right? The multitude, or the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, which do the result of a multitude, feeding a multitude. That happens a couple different times in the scriptures. And they actually have so much left over, there's more than they started with. So it's not as if there isn't any of that going on. But it's sort of capricious. God chooses when he's going to do that. He doesn't set up a dole. He doesn't set up a welfare program. He doesn't say, all right, be here next Friday, and I will give you this from the soup kitchen. And if you have an income below this level, we're going to give you this and that. There's nothing along those lines. Instead, it's always sort of random. You know, the disciples after the resurrection find Christ on the seashore. He says, have some fish. Right? He didn't tell them ahead of time, hey, meet me a couple days after the resurrection, and we'll have a nice fish together, and maybe chat a bit. It's all when God chooses to do it. And this is part of what the Grand Inquisitor doesn't like about that. He says, look, if you could do it then, you can do it any time. Why didn't you choose to do that? And he reads, he says to him some very important things. I'm going to read you a few passages. He says, before you can ask people for virtue, before you can ask people for obedience, before you can ask people to forgive, to do the things that they ought to do, you have to actually feed them. You actually have to satisfy their basic needs and desires. He says, turn these stones into loaves of bread, and men will follow you like cattle, docile and grateful, and constantly fearful lest you withdraw your hand and they lose their loaves. But you didn't want to deprive man of freedom, and you rejected the suggestion, for you thought, what sort of freedom would they have if their obedience was bought with bread? So Christ valued freedom as good above bread, and he not only valued it for himself, he valued it for human beings. He wanted to leave the option open, which is in fact to honor freedom. The Grand Inquisitor says, freedom is no good to you if you don't have bread. As a matter of fact, people will in fact trade freedom for bread. He says, in the end, they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, enslave us, but feed us. And they will finally understand that freedom and the assurance of daily bread for everyone are two incompatible notions that could never coexist. They will also discover that men can never be free because they are weak, corrupt, worthless, and restless. He's saying, satisfy their basic needs. That is a greater good. The devil offered you the chance to do that. You chose not to do it. What the hell is wrong with you? Now we have to do it. This is where he's talking about this. The second temptation, and actually at this point, Dostoevsky, or Ivan rather, is jumbling things up. Because the second temptation, the devil takes Christ up and he shows him all the kingdoms of the world, and he says, hey, they're yours. Just do me homage. Just, say you'll do things my way. And Jesus rejects that as well. So, power. I put that second here in part, but that's actually getting treated third. Power, or what, the people who are acceding to power, what are they getting out of it? Security. The other thing that he talks about, the other temptation, which he spends a lot of time on, this is very interesting. The devil takes him up to the top of the temple in Jerusalem, and he says, jump. Now, is he like, trying to get him to kill himself or something like that? No, he's actually saying, tempt God. Put God to the test. Jump. Because if you do, the angels are going to catch you. This is a really big temptation. And there actually are portions of Scripture where God tells people, hey, put me to the test. I want you to. Come on, ask for something. In this case, the temptation is there, and Jesus says, I'm not going to do that. And this is really interesting. Dostoevsky has Ivan have the Grand Inquisitor tell Christ that, people will actually, in order to try to assuage their conscience, to have a good conscience about things, they will give in. Just, give them heavenly bread. Give them the capacity to feel okay about themselves, to feel they're connected to everybody, that things make sense. You can give them that, and then they will actually be quite happy. He says, where is that? He says, how do we actually make this work? Miracle, mystery, and authority. People want to be told what to do. They want to give their freedom up. They want somebody else to tell them they're doing the right thing. Whether it's a political cause or an economic enterprise, whether it's how they live their life as a sports fan, as a father, as a mother, as a child, as a consumer, all these sorts of things. People want somebody else to tell them, hey, you're doing the right thing. You're okay if you do things this way. And that's giving over one's freedom for feeling good. That's a temptation. And the Grand Inquisitor says to Christ, look, you had the opportunity to set things right long ago, but you didn't do it. So now we, and at this point he's talking about the church, but this is something that's got great implications for not just a church, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but for any sort of organization, anything that would claim to satisfy us. He says, you could have made human beings happy if you had just given into this. You would have made human beings happy. You would have laid out a path for them. Sure, they would have had to give up freedom. Sure, the love that they would have given you would have been on account of these things, not because they actually chose to love you for your own sake. That would have been the loving thing to do. And there the Grand Inquisitor is showing he got love wrong. It was more loving for Christ to leave these things to human beings. That's the sort of subtext to this that the Grand Inquisitor isn't getting. So the Grand Inquisitor says, you screwed up, so now we have to set the plan right. We are going to make it work. Because otherwise, too many people are going to suffer. We're going to actually, he says, for the first time, think about how we can make human beings happy. We can think about human happiness with a capital H for everybody. Well, almost everybody. And that's what we're going to get to another interesting part in a moment. Now, Christ doesn't say anything to all of this stuff. The Grand Inquisitor says his whole speech. He's laying out a sort of systematic understanding of things, a systematic way of looking at goods, a systematic way of understanding the human being in relation to something higher. Who is actually going to carry out all of this work, all this coordination that's going to be required? Who's going to provide the food? Who's going to provide the salved consciences? Who's going to actually exercise power, provide security, all those sorts of things? He says there's going to be 100,000 inquisitors who are actually not going to be happy. That's the price that they have to pay. They're sort of like, in his view, doing what it was that Jesus did in the Christian narratives, which is to take on the sufferings of all so that the rest of them can, in fact, be happy. And here they're imagining human beings doing this. So these are going to be human beings that are actually seeing what's going on behind the scenes, and they see the lies, and they see that things are not as good as they're being made out to be. And they see that they've taken Christianity and sort of turned it on its head. They have to live with that. They have to live with that suffering. Why is that good? Why is that the way to go, according to the Grand Inquisitor? Because anything else would be worse. Should we just abandon all the rest of them to their suffering? I mean, God didn't do his job. Now it's up to us to do the job, to take over. Where God didn't follow through, we're going to follow through and then some. And he says, if this means being in league with the devil, then that's fine. We'll be in league with the devil. Because the devil actually knew better than Christ what to do. A few words here I want to say about church and organizations and stuff like that. There's an interesting conflict of point of views between Ivan and Alyosha on this. Ivan says, this makes perfect sense. This is the way the Catholic Church is. The Jesuits just come, right out and say this sort of thing. The Grand Inquisitor actually says at one point, "You gave your power over to us. That's it. You didn't choose to exercise the power. We, the Church, take the power." And Alyosha, at a certain point, says, "Hold on there. Are you saying that the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, behaves like this? Because guess what? I'm an Orthodox monk. I'm not a Catholic monk. But guess what? You didn't even get the Catholics right. Because I've known, some Catholics, and they don't actually behave like this. And, maybe the Jesuits do, to a certain extent. But even they don't behave like this. You're kind of, presenting a false picture here." And then Ivan says something really interesting. He says, "Well, okay, I'll grant that to you. But I think there have been some human beings through history who actually have said the sorts of things and had the sorts of thoughts that the Grand Inquisitor did, and wanted to lay out that kind of program, and had those kind of ideas in mind, and I think some of them were in the Church. As a matter of fact, I don't say that all of them were in the Church. I think the Masons are like that. And here they get into a little discussion about the Masons. And that's why the Jesuits hate the Masons so much, because they see in them a competitor. Now, if we think about this in our century, where have we seen these kind of promises made? Not so much by churches. I mean, it doesn't matter how you feel about the Catholic Church. It's lost its, sort of worldly presence, which was on the wane for centuries anyway. But in the 20th century, like Stalin at one point asked, "How many divisions does the Church have? I've got this many. Britain has this many. The United States has this many." So it's not in that sort of power. What has claimed to do that sort of thing? It's been mainly ideologies. I think that you could see within the discourses and the practices of many of the communists, and even to a certain extent the fascists or national socialists or integral nationalists, the sort of thing that's being discussed in the Grand Inquisitor. We're going to make human beings happy. They have to give us their freedom. They have to give love, but not on their own terms. And, any sort of supernatural, transcendent thing that's not just a matter of, the state or the organization, has to be effaced, has to be sucked in somehow. That has been sometimes the case. So that's something particularly important. I'd like to think about a few other things too before we finish up. One of these is, because we talked a lot about freedom. What is freedom? Are there different understandings of freedom? The Grand Inquisitor says, hey, these people out here who we're fooling, they think they're free. Could that be the case in our own society? Are there many people who think that they're free when really they are being controlled by, not necessarily some sort of, overarching, cover everything, totalitarian entity, but other things that where they give their freedom over. People think that they're being free when really somebody else is calling the shots, playing their heartstrings, dealing in their emotions, supplying them the things that they want, and then getting what they want from them. I think that there probably is quite a bit of that. We can ask ourselves sometimes, is that the case for us? What about the men of the Inquisition? Not just the men of the age of the Inquisition who lay their freedom at the feet of the Inquisitors, but the Inquisitors themselves. He says they're free. They take on the burden of freedom. They face up to it. They also face up to the fact that most people can't handle freedom. and they suffer as a result. But here's something to think about. Let's assume that Dostoevsky actually sides more with Alyosha than with Ivan, and that he's trying to get us to see that the Grand Inquisitor is actually wrong. Maybe quite attractive in prospect or argument, but is actually wrong. That would mean that he misconceived the nature of freedom. You're right, he is more free than the people he's deceiving. We're kind of like cattle. But in a certain sense, he's not fully free either. Giving in to these temptations makes you less free, gives something else power over you. At a certain point, the Grand Inquisitor says, peace, even death, is more attractive to man than freedom of choice that derives from the knowledge of good and evil. Once we start to think, knowledge of good and evil is not the best term too. It's not like we actually know, with perfect clarity, this is good, this is evil. It often ends up being quite murky. It's not a matter that it isn't black and white, but the black and white are often so intertwined that they're hard to distinguish apart from each other. They do often look gray. Do we actually want to give up our freedom because of the anxiety that it produces for us? Because of the fact that when we exercise it, sometimes we do deprive ourselves of our bodily needs, that we lose power or security, that we feel sometimes upset. We don't know whether we're doing the right thing. We don't know whether we're buying into the right thing. To be able to remain in that moment, I think, for Dostoevsky, is part of what freedom means. To be able to, for Alyosha, to look to love and to look to Christ, even though he can't make sense of them completely, and certainly can't satisfy his brother with respect to them, is a kind of freedom that the Grand Inquisitor just wants to efface. He does recognize that as freedom, but it's not freedom for him. A few other interesting questions. The Grand Inquisitor, does he actually believe in God? Alyosha says, no, he doesn't believe in God. He's a godless sort. But he does, doesn't he? I mean, he's talking to Christ and he says, I believe that you did these things. You just got them wrong. You didn't do what you needed to do. So here we can ask ourselves, what does it mean to believe in God? Does it mean to have some sort of propositional belief there is a God? Jesus Christ, was his son. He did such and such a thing at such and such a time. Or does it mean something more performative, something more a matter of the heart and of the human will and action, doing things, aligning oneself? Is believing something like pledging one's allegiance to something in this case? If that's the case, clearly the Grand Inquisitor doesn't believe in God. He certainly does believe in God in the sense that he thinks that God exists and God made the world. He just thinks God didn't do it as he should, so that human beings now can step into the gap. What does rebellion mean? This term rebellion comes up over and over again. Ivan himself is called a rebel by Alyosha. That's why he brings up this whole Grand Inquisitor passage. The Grand Inquisitor calls himself and his compatriots rebels as well. But he also talks about humanity in the whole, the weak, the corrupt, as being rebellious, and as the Grand Inquisitor and the Inquisition as being able to sort of put them in place so they're no longer rebellious, no longer striving to have their own thing at the expense of others. Is there another kind of rebellion? Is rebellion always bad? Is rebellion always good? These are sort of open questions that this allows you to explore. Another thing that this opens up as well is this question: what is more right? What is more just? What is more good? To set things up so that the weak, the failures, the mass of humans can sort of be channeled into the proper areas so that they can have what the Grand Inquisitor is calling happiness. That's going to rule out some of the few. It's going to harness some of the few. They're stuck, being cogs in the machine of the Inquisition. It's also going to rule out, say Jesus Christ. He better not show up again. And those who are sort of, committed to him, the strong, as he calls them, the saints, they better not show up either. Is it better to serve the happiness of the majority, the vast majority? Or is something destroyed in that process? Is something left out? Is there something vital lost? That's where I'm going to end.